Bonsoir, Madame et Monsieur. Bom, eu vou falar em português, peço para já desculpa a todos.
I'm going to speak Portuguese.
É uma honra
I
enorme
would like to
estar aqui,
apologize for this.
pela
It's a great
pela
honor
segunda
to be
vez
here.
na Cité,
This is the
nesta
second
belíssima
time
sala, convosco,
that I'm
com
here in this room,
imensos
this
amigos.
beautiful room with you.
É uma honra também
Many of my
estar aqui
friends are
contemplado
here too. It's
por
also an
esta
honor
animação,
to
especialmente com o elenco
be able to
que esta Global Award foi
speak
tendo ao longo do tempo, e especialmente
and be
com esta,
part of
com esta presença
this
enorme
global
de
award,
líderes.
be one of the
Eu venho
laureates,
falar,
and it's
portanto, de
very
cinco
important for me to be
projetos,
here.
Aliás, 3 obras e 2 projetos.
I'm going to talk about
3
5
obras
projects,
possivelmente as mais
well, 3 works and
reconhecíveis,
5 projects,
que convocaram a estar aqui, e 2 pequenos trabalhos, um deles que corresponde a um pensamento.
works which are well known, and 2 other works that are related.
Uma imagem dos anos 40.
I would like to start with this picture, which dates back to 1949. It's by a Portuguese artist who was in Brazil then, Nano Lemos. This is a picture of refusal.
De uma identidade.
Refusal of an identity. So to me, what's important here
do meu tema,
is
da minha condição geográfica, da qual trabalho,
the question of
insular,
where I am.
geográfico muito específico.
I work on an island, so geography is very specific,
ser, no fundo, convocatória
not only
tempo,
because it's an
de uma
island,
erosão
but
constante,
also because it's an eroding island, which means that we constantly have to build a concept which is to build it in very difficult conditions.
E na sua nomeação participar, estar presente numa arquitetura mais que trabalha o ínfimo, que trabalha a singularidade e dispensa.
So the Global Award usually rewards singularity
dos aparatos formalistas.
and simplicity, formal simplicity. This is where I live. It's an island. I've tried to draw a picture of this. It is a mountain that comes from deep in the ocean, 500 meters of altitude, and I live at the very top of the island, above that line which depicts the ocean. I live on a fifth of this territory, and this drawing helps us understand very immediately the question of rooting and what it means to live on an island. Insularity is always brings singularity. We are surrounded by water, but we are deeply rooted, and we have strong links to the soil, to the shore. Our Japanese friend was telling me, I don't know where Madeira is. Well, I'm showing it to him. It's very close to the African and European continents. We are part of an archipelago of volcanic islands. As geographers say, these are true islands that come from the very bottom of the ocean. I'd like now to show you a few pictures which are important. This is a visual inventory. It's part of my collection, and it's going to help you understand that territory. Now, what we can see here are 2 photographs. You can see the coastline. This is what you first see when you get to the island. And it's not a plain line, it's not an accessible line. It's, as you can see, it's very fractured, and accessing the land is very difficult. So, to become, well, people had to transform the island to be able to live on it, and it's a constant endeavor that, well, to transform the island. This is a military construction, which was not done by an architect, but to me, it has a great meaning because it shows deep knowledge of the topography. It shows relation between the ocean, the surface of the earth, how to create doors, how to have access to the territory. And we also have two temporalities, the volcano, the base, in a way, and the building that has been built by man, which is made by the same material which has been transformed. So this is a single, well, really very single element, very unique. This picture is very important to me. I go to this place very often. A Portuguese writer actually says that when you're in doubt, when you don't know where you are, you need to read the same book over and over again. Why is that? Well, I don't know, but that's what this picture means to me. This is a place where I go over and over again to understand the territory, to understand how my feet are connected to the ground. This idea of how we are touching the place on which we're living, how we're touching a territory, how our feet are connected to that territory. These are other expressions, other shapes, very vernacular. The idea being, once again, to try and do something despite the difficulty of the land. Verticality is something that is constant on our territory, and this is something that we have to work with. Those waterways that you can see on the left are the first waterways built by men. The idea was to discover the territory, and to the right you can see waterways which were built later and that helped people live on this territory. The south side of the island does not have water, so people had to take water from the north and bring it to the south side of the island. This is why those waterways were built. The idea being to adapt to the topography, and this is what really drives those types of buildings. The idea being to conquer territories, to move higher and higher with rudimentary buildings, but buildings that can defeat the space in a way that can transform the space. This is something which is also very interesting. I wish I had built that pool myself because it's pretty amazing. It shows, well, it really mimics the geometry of the island. And to us, architecture should be place-specific and should be related to the place in which it is. It should be really place-specific. I would like to show you a number of projects. This is part of an exhibition which was held in Lisbon. It's a room which is in a cultural facility, the Belém Cultural Facility in Lisbon. It used to be a parking lot, and we completely renovated it and turned it into an exhibition space for architecture. It is now a major exhibition room where you can see exhibitions about Portuguese architecture. The topic here was landscape and architecture. So two architects, a landscape architect and myself, worked together on this idea of territory, on the link with the territory. The idea being to take all the materials that we've used in our work and show how we worked on our different projects. This exhibition was designed like a literary work with chapters, but the idea was to show how architecture is rooted in a territory. This is the west side of the island. We're on a mountain. I was talking about limits. Well, the idea here was to build an artistic facility with outside of the city. As you know, art centers are usually downtown, because, well, in the cities have more creativity, and that's usually due to political decisions. And here, because of the territory, the space, as part of the decentralization policy, the idea was to take the art center out of its usual environment. The difficulty was because of the mountain, the space was also very agricultural, so these were the limits of the project. How to create a window, how to create a door with those constraints, how to create 12,000 square meters of building in a place where it's very difficult for an architect to transform the landscape. Now you can see this space with very deep shapes. The idea being to develop that logic with the limits of this mountain. We still have military buildings in that space that look like fortresses, and that also have these constraints, these limits. People look at a territory, they have initial ideas, and then they try to create a platform on which they will erect the building. But here we did the contrary. We created the platform first, and then underground, through excavation, we kept building. It was our way of conquering the land, the territory. We tried to fragment the different objects. These are the mock-ups. On this picture, to the front, you can see the excavation work. It was done in the very rock of the mountain. And in the next slide, we'll see the object which was created. It will help us understand the abstraction of the project. It is a very hands-on project, but it also has an abstract side to it. You can see this picture that shows us that we were building with those limits. This was our project for this art center, to comply with the limits imposed by the mountain itself. And with this idea of limits, we're trying to create collective areas, public areas, where people can meet, a platform with fragmented spaces. We didn't want people to be able to identify the art center immediately, but we wanted people to discover it gradually. So we adapted our work to the landscape. This is how we adapted our work to the landscape. Here you can see our program. An art center which was built on the island. We had a number of challenges. We had to create an auditorium. Despite the limits of the territory, we had to create volumes big enough for the visitors. We had to welcome the population and meet their expectations, and also take into account the number of visitors that might come. So we had to make calculations, just like well, in a plane, but just like when you calculate the number of people that can get into a plane, we had to calculate possible number of visitors. Then we had to created openings, measured the depth, and erected our building. So it's like a promenade in a way, with a central patio that distributes the different rooms. This is an exhibition space, exhibition room. It's always very difficult to design such spaces because art is very unpredictable. We tried to have all the necessary elements to create a space that would be adapted to its function. So we tried to hide all the technical requirements. You don't see the bottom of the walls, you don't see the air conditioning system. We tried to conceal all the technical elements to put art to the front. We also created very long corridors to work on the idea of depth. We worked with lights. We worked on the way light comes into the building, which also has something to do with depth, and the light changes depending on the moment of the day. We worked on the openings to create a link between the inside and the outside. This is the front of the building, and it is the result of this inner journey of ours. The idea was to create perspectives that were consistent with the territory, to have a sort of georeferencing. In deeper rooms, we created this big screen opening that overlooks the ocean. We're trying to frame the horizon with a very deep view, always with this idea of opening the space and opening it to the ocean. We use local material, volcanic stone. You can see it in the first box, as small as possible. And then we also use a specific kind of stone created by the tide. We managed to use these volcanic material because the building was a public building, because individuals are not allowed, legally allowed to use that type of material. So now, well, in a way, the project was also created by the ocean. We try to explore verticality because the building was erected on a mountain. We tried to work with the territory and turn the building into an abstract drawing. This is the big platform. Which is a kind of pause for the visitors. On the islands, during a period when Portugal joined the European Union, everything started to go very fast, and the island started to develop very fast. And we were used to slow life. We had tracks on which people moved slowly, but today we have expressways and everything is much faster. So this well, before, to get to that place, it was a 2-3 hour journey, but today in 20 minutes you can get there. So this idea of speed and geography is also very important. Our geography implies slowness, but human beings can make things go faster. So this is a kind of space amnesia. Those tunnels are kind of space amnesia. We are forgetting the place in which we are. This is more of an observation place. This is another project that I would like to present. It was also shown in the exhibition, also with this idea of the limits, but close to the ocean. You can see this black basaltic area, which is related to the volcano, because when the lava gets into the ocean, it cools down very quickly and creates this rock, very specific rock. That gradually disappears and is covered by water. So we tried to make it part of our heritage and to preserve it. This space has been used in different ways throughout the time. There has been erosion because of the violence of the ocean. This cliff is eroding very fast. It's threatened with disappearance. And it's also a very poor area. We were creating a public facility for that population in that place, west from the city. Here you can see Lobos, Câmara de Lobos, where
neste momento é uma vila pescatória que tem como condição pescar o peixe mais profundo do oceano.
Seals used to live.
3.000 metros de profundidade, pescar peixe negro profundo. Portanto, e tem umas técnicas
fish. There was a certain type of fish that lived here, and fishermen were using very specific techniques to fish. This is a very rudimentary village with an oven. It was also a storage area for salt. I collected pictures that show the different uses of the space. This was a fisherman. This is also an area where fish was being dried. It's a kind of fish which is specific to our island, and this is the place where it was dried. It gives off a very nasty smell when it dries, so people usually can't stay very long in that place. So this place has long history, sometimes a difficult history. Population didn't have access to public areas, to public buildings. This line shows how the coast was defended. And this path today has two functions. First, people can take it, and also goods. But it also stabilizes the cliff. In the lower part, you can see that geometrical drawing that shows the very difficult features of this place. And a pool was built on the ocean. The upper part was built by layers. The limit of this space is not very clearly defined. The idea was to build between this line, which stabilizes the cliff, to maintain that existing line, and to build the containment wall with local stone. We used existing shapes, we used existing tracks and paths, and adapted them. The geology of this place is very interesting, and we tried to work with this volcanic landscape.
You could see something very similar here. We have this path that goes around the contours of the island. Again, we have this strong idea of the outer limit. It's a very old path on the island that goes around the boundary of the island. It's an outlook onto the ocean, and it gives you this wonderful opportunity to link up the sea and the land. Now here, in this sequence, we have defined in the course of time different profiles depending on the territorial line. We don't have any technical data, but you could imagine that all this work was done progressively, gradually, and constantly. This is now the swimming pool in this part, in the curved part of the project, so that we contained the lava concept. And here we have this wall that creates a sort of trilogy on the upper part. And it's a wall supporting or retaining the cliff. And we could also build this pool, this basin. It's almost a cyclopic idea. The idea is that we are here creating an outer limit, and from then on you can't build any further. This is the absolute limit. So this is the upper part of the pool with the form of dissipation of energies coming from the ocean. We are here facing the Atlantic Ocean, let me remind you. And by the way, some days it's a very rough sea that we are facing. Now we're working with the idea that we shouldn't work based on an absence of drawings or sketches, as we did, with the art center. But it was important not to have any sketches or anything, because this was going to be disappearing. The level rises with an ebb and flow and decreases. And we could even exceed these limits if the sea level is very high. So the project was not the same depending on the days, depending on the height of the tide. So we really had to have a project that would be in sync with the harshness, with the roughness of the ocean. We have here a slightly higher project. When we build on these limits, on the outer limits, we need to have clearly in mind the idea of darkness, of shade, of shadow. It doesn't really exist. It's such a dry area that the shade, the shadow itself, has to be caused, has to be created. It doesn't exist of its own accord. And we even wanted to build a garden, still around the same logic of having a space which will have to adapt, to adjust to its natural environment, in which we had flowers, we had fruit trees, we had vineyards, and vineyards, of course, are a major feature in Madeira. And still in the idea of the construction of objects within the boundaries, within the limits, we find here characteristics that we could find everywhere. We have the dominant species of flora. We plant wine, vineyards. Vineyards are at a very high level of relief, so agricultural productions or crops are in the lower areas, and we have vineyards higher up. So you could see here, this is an example of vineyards being planted at high altitude. We have here what we call the letade. We have this picture here of the stone that was broken in several pieces. You have here the first paths that were ever built on the island, and they had precisely this shape. So that's the idea of, compensating for the faults, for the cracks in the ground, and the idea of rebuilding the initial channels or the ducts in order to capture the water at a higher level in order to irrigate downstream, to irrigate gardens and plants that are at a lower level. We have here the inner space of the building. You can see how it was designed. The purpose here was to dedicate this area to several specific uses. The purpose here in the opening of the door was to make the ocean visible. Here again, we are trying to create a frame, to frame the horizon. And still we have this timber structure that allows us also to really blend it smoothly in the outside environment. We have the idea of the erosion of the space, of this very noble aging of the material. And you can see this wood here that ages very well. You see the wood and the steel that will work with time, that will age in the course of time, and that will age differently. And you have here, again, this opening that I was talking about, giving out onto the ocean. It's a sort of it echoes the environment around it. And it's really interesting, by the way, to listen to the sounds. Whenever we work on the outer limits of the land towards the ocean, and this building allows us to hear the different sounds coming from the ocean, to transport them, to have them resonate in the space within. So it's a sort of, resonance box for the sounds coming from the ocean. This is a project that we have on the northern facade, on the northern part of the island. It's a very rough climate, as you can see. You can see that there are very rugged ridges and contours, and this is very rough environment. It's almost at the genesis of the volcano on the island, and we found these channels running through the island They're like channels that run through, and it's really interesting to visit, in fact, these natural channels, these caves, digging the rock naturally. And one of the major issues here was that of accessibility of the place. It wasn't easy, because this is a place that is on a granite cliff, located on a granite cliff that is highly unstable. So granite cliff, very unstable, and it was very difficult to visit the space because the mountain was always, dangerous. There were, rocks falling from the mountain, for example, and all of this made for a very dangerous situation. So therefore, we needed to implement a sort of staircase system, and we needed to establish connections between two different worlds. So this is a construction that helps us protect the point of access, the accessibility, the main purpose being to create a sort of training for our eyes. We wanted a smooth transition. We're in a world where there's a lot of light, and we are heading for a much deeper, darker world. So we wanted to adjust our eyes to very different light conditions. So we created these successive or gradual openings in order for your eyes to get used to this change of light. And you could see the interplay of light and shade. Going from the darker colors towards lighter light intensity. Here on this mountain, we are in the north. There's a great deal of water resources up north. Now, these mountains and this water is what actually caused the instability on the island. And these elements made us think that we wanted to create a sort of basin. We wanted to lock up these water resources. And this is something we do a lot in Madeira. You can see the basin on the right to retain the water as a tank of water. We wanted to use that water in order to irrigate the fields nearby, to irrigate the land, the adjoining land, the vineyards, etc. And we wanted to be able to develop agriculture. So human beings have always developed this space on the island by creating platforms on which they can actually grow plants and agriculture. We have here a very simple drawing. The idea here was to create, again, a basin to collect water coming from the mountains and use that water in order to irrigate the adjacent garden in a very natural fashion. You could see here a picture of the basin from the mountaintop, and this is how we could use that water, again, to irrigate, to water the plants in the garden. This is still a project. It hasn't been built yet. We're still in a phase of discussions. We want to create a shelter on a contour line. This is a fortress, a very small size fortress, a military-type construction. There are many such constructions around the boundary of the island. And the idea was, of course, to build a fortress to defend the island against pirates. So there are many such fortresses and forts alongside the territory. They've lost their functions, of course, gradually. But this structure, for example, is a ruin. And it was interesting for us, we felt, to work on these ruins and to turn the ruins into a sort of continuation of the volcanic lava from the volcano. In this area, we saw more and more tourists, the presence of tourists on this coast. And we saw also that some summer houses or summer buildings or housing buildings were being created. And this, of course, was jeopardizing our initial objective, and this did not blend in at all with the natural environment. Here again, we have a defensive structure erected at the beginning of the 15th century or 16th century. People would attack from the sea. Now, tourists are attacking from the other side, from the land. So we're now in an awkward situation. The idea is that we would like to make sure that Madeira will be a an island of hospitality, not a tourist island, but hospitality island. Today, we get the feeling that we are condemned to be tourists. You can't just be a traveler anymore. You have to be a tourist. And we felt that this was a great opportunity for us to go against the grain, to go against the models imposed by modern tourism. For example, let's say you sit on a plane. The plane is air-conditioned. You leave the plane. Then you take a Uber taxi. Then you get to a hotel with a very good and comfortable accommodation. And if we want to know what will be the climate conditions, all we have to do is look at our, iPhone app. But the idea was to do the exact opposite here, try to capture all of the radicalities that are specific to this venue, to this place. Our objective here is to be confronted to the limits. We don't want to touch this ruin. We want to create two different areas, two spaces, one space, one venue, which is part of the ruin itself, but it's not touching it very clearly. And then we also want to create the idea of a floating. Because the structure has to defend against an attack coming from the ocean and from the ocean only. The idea is timelessness. If I sit in my living room and I go to sleep, I have to go to see the ocean, I have to see the violence of the ocean, and I'm confronted with the harsh weather conditions. I have no other choice. I have to see them. So this is the model for the project. We have the specific sleeping area, and we have what happens within that ruin structure with the volcanic ash. We introduce what we call a melody when we build houses, buildings. Choreography is of the essence. The bodies within, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a choreography of the bodies that will move within that structure. The more I understand this choreography, the better built my object will be. And this kind of choreography can create some kind of unforeseeability in the dancing of this volcanic ash. And then we have this big roof, which encapsulates the bodies that are moving. And this again creates this resonance box. There's a sort of competition being played out between the sound of the person walking, laying its feet on this volcano ash, and the sound coming from the ocean, echoing. So this is the drawing with the two different sub-projects. This is reinvented typology to the extreme. And then we have this raised section. Again, this is a mock-up. Still a project. We have to convey the idea of levitation, of a defensive structure, a structure that defends the island against the attacks from tourists. So we want to encircle all of these elements in the outer limits. We don't want to redesign a contemporary fortress. We keep what already exists. We keep this initial idea, we keep the ruins, but at the same time we create these openings, these piercings in the facade. In other words, this is an idea of defending the island against different incoming attacks. So you have here fragments of lava, the lava coming from the volcano, once transformed by men on the right-hand side, and the use of volcanic ash. I was talking about volcanic ash, and we are currently reusing it. We compact it into a thick, solid material that we then reuse. And it becomes a sort of resin, a simple resin that helps us come up with new materials. And we have this new sort of rapport or relation with materials. We use the materials because of their physical composition, but also because of their background history, what they mean, where they come from. And so this is a building that is made up of the lava coming from the volcano. The idea is to defend the territory, because it's a fortress after all. And then we have the final element, which is the volcano, and that is the end of the process. And this is a photograph taken at the Venice Biennale. Funchale. We had a project here which consisted in presenting the storm. This exemplifies the storm. What is the storm? Well, the storm is mass tourism on an island such as Madeira. It is felt as a sort of aggression, as a sort of attack. And there are disastrous events taking place in the wake of such mass tourism. So that's the idea that is exemplified by this storm. So this is done against the backdrop of the ocean. The ocean context is taken on board. We have here an idea. Let's say a few words about Funchal again. Funchal is a city that is deeply scarred or marked by Europeans outside of the European continent for the first experiments of the Portuguese when they first made discoveries on the Atlantic coast. So it's the first steps taken by the Portuguese heading for globalization. It was the beginning of globalization. It was experimented by the first Portuguese who set foot on the island. Last year, unfortunately, a very serious fire spread across the island. It started in the mountains and then it spread because of violent crosswinds. And it swept across the whole city of Funchal. It's a very rare event, by the way. We have very few such fires in the cities. This would be typical of the 18th century, but not of our century. But this is also the result of the urban sprawl. There was a lot of urban sprawl because of this mass tourism. And this is also because we've given up or neglected the forest at the same time. And both phenomena actually accelerated this process. We've been invited to think around these issues. We decided to create a specific workshop for urban development, and we put our heads together with locally elected representatives to try to do a sort of critical reconnaissance and to try to rebuild on that basis the city as it should have remained. This is a drawing. Sort of inverted decoration. It's like a large amphitheater with the coastline at the bottom, and you could see a large amphitheater marked by three terraces, by three lines where water seeps through. So water has always been a characteristic and typical feature of our island. We have water in the form of an ocean, and we have the water that is on the island itself. We move from 0 degrees to at 1,800 meters in altitude to the water temperature of the sea. There's an acceleration when it rains, and this is what creates these ridges in the forest going from the top all the way to the city. So we wanted to go back in time, to go back in history, and we wanted to rewrite geography. How can an architect tell the story of a city? Is it possible to do so? Portuguese architecture is transforming itself, and we have an opportunity now to think again about the logic of the city, and we have to rethink urban development. We understand now that topography can be a driver when it comes to reshaping the territory. It is possible now to reinterpret a space. We see here the influence of geology, the live rocks. You can see the black lines that mark the presence of the volcanoes still today in the city. It's a presence of the volcanoes that is camouflaged by the plant cover and by the urban constructions. But we would like to highlight once again these geological features. We try to re-naturalize or to restore the natural environment in this area, to re-green the area. Again, the idea is to have an architecture that is respectful of our environment. This is a water painting that was produced by a Russian painter who visited the island And I think in this painting, he expresses very well the genuine, the authenticity of the island. When we decide to follow this logic of topography, being respectful of the topography is key. Thank you.